Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Foreign Policy Panel discussion on the international challenge, getting chemical weapons out of Syria. I'm Heidi Shue, President of the Council, and it's my privilege to welcome you here on behalf of the Board of Directors and members of the Council. A month ago, it seemed as though the United States was on the brink of another military engagement, this time in Syria, and this time with no coalition, or of standing by as Syrian civilians were being slaughtered with government-controlled chemical weapons. Then the nearly unthinkable happened when the Russians followed up on what seemed like a rhetorical aside by the U.S. Secretary of State, and several days of discussions resulted in UN Security Council Resolution 2118, a plan to remove Syria's chemical weapons stockpile with international monitors. That was the easy part. Now comes the hard part. Will it work? Will the inspectors have access to all the sites? And if so, what will be the impact on the internal uprising going on in Syria, on the ability of the Assad regime to hold on to power, on the potential outcomes? These are all part of the international challenge now unfolding in and around Syria. To discuss the situation, we have assembled a panel of three very qualified guests. Michael Moodie is an expert in chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, having served as the Assistant Director of Multilateral Affairs on the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and in other positions directly related to the tracking, oversight, and analysis of weapons of mass destruction. He currently is an Assistant Director and Special Senior Assistant at the Congressional Research Service. Joel Rubin is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the Ploughshares Fund, a foundation that works toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. He is a former congressional aide, having worked for 2 United States senators, and a diplomat, having worked at the Department of State in both the Near Eastern Affairs and Political Military Affairs bureaus. He appears frequently on major foreign and domestic media outlets. Our moderator is Dr. Susan Koch, a distinguished research fellow at the National Defense University Center for the Study of Weapons of Mass Destruction. She served as a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, as Director for Proliferation Strategy, and as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control on the White House's National Security Council staff. Dr. Koch has received the Presidential Distinguished Executive Award, the Presidential Meritorious Executive Award, and the Department of Defense Distinguished Civilian Service Award 5 times, among others. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you so much. I'll take a few minutes just to set the stage and then turn it over to the people who really know this stuff. Obviously, since the Syrian uprising began in February 2011, it's developed into a full-scale civil war with unimaginable human cost and physical destruction and just multiple layers of sectarian, regional, international terrorist threats and complexity. Added to that terrible picture are the dangers posed by Syria's chemical weapons stockpile. Dangers of the use of those weapons against the Syrian population, of potential loss of regime control over them to radical opposition elements, of either deliberate or inadvertent transfer to terrorist groups, including the regime's friends of Hezbollah. And there may be others. Obviously, the question of how to respond to the Syrian civil war has plagued the U.S. government almost since the beginning of the conflict. Just over a year ago, President Obama very famously said that Syrian transfer or use of chemical weapons would be a red line for the United States. There were various reports of Syrian government use of chemical weapons after that, especially this past April, but no international action. Then on August 21st was the massive chemical attack in the Damascus suburbs. We estimate killed about 1,500 people, including over 400 children. The United States and our allies quickly ascribed the attack to the Assad government based on the scale of the attack, its coordination, the delivery systems used, saying it could only have come from the government. Russia demurred, claimed, and still argues that it well could have been done by the opposition. As you know, most observers expected a fairly early, albeit limited, U.S. military action against the Syrian regime in response to the attack. But first, the president announced that he would seek congressional approval, and then within a couple of weeks, on September 14th, the United States and Russia agreed instead on the very new approach, a framework that was accepted fairly quickly in turn by the Syrian regime, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which, forgive me, I will refer to as OPCW, otherwise we'll be here for a long time, the implementing body for the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the UN Security Council. Essential parts of the framework were immediate Syrian accession to the Chemical Weapons Convention and the rapid elimination of its chemical weapons and means of producing them. The Chemical Weapons Convention entered into force in 1997. It bans the development, production, possession, transfer, and perhaps other things of chemical weapons. Until last month, Syria had been one of only 7 states in the world not to ratify the convention. On September 14th, undoubtedly under great pressure from its Russian ally, the Syrian government just deposited its instrument of ratification of the convention, taking the first step in implementing the framework agreement. Inspectors from the OPCW are already in Syria to begin inspecting chemical weapon sites and eventually oversee destruction of the Syrian chemical weapons program, agents, production equipment, delivery systems. The schedule laid down by the OPCW and the Security Council for the elimination of Syria's chemical weapons program is very ambitious. Major milestones include immediate Syrian declarations of its chemical weapons stockpile, locations, delivery systems, production facilities, with final full declarations before the end of this month. Second, by the 1st of November, initial OPCW inspections of all chemical weapons production and storage facilities and destruction of all production and mixing filling equipment. And finally, third, destruction of all chemical weapons material and equipment in the first half of next year, 2014. And the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, just specified 30 June. Now, that's almost 9 months, which may sound like a long time, until you consider that the Chemical Weapons Convention allowed the initial parties 10 years to destroy their chemical weapons and provided for a 5-year extension. The U.S. and Russia still haven't destroyed all of their chemical weapons, more than 16 years after the treaty entered into force. Of course, Syria has a much smaller chemical weapons stockpile than either the U.S. or Russia once did, but it's still substantial. About 1,000 metric tons, mostly of the nerve agent sarin, but also several hundred metric tons of mustard gas and several tens of metric tons of the very, very toxic nerve agent VX. The elimination task is eased by the fact that most Syrian chemical weapons are apparently in bulk, not in munitions, but it's still far from simple. Transfer to another state. Transfer of the weapons, the material outside of Syria would help eliminate the program, if not the weapons, much more quickly. But transfer raises its own concerns, which we probably will discuss a bit. Meanwhile, all of this is happening in a war zone. And none of us, no state, the OPCW, no one has any experience in implementing the Chemical Weapons Convention or doing anything comparable in a conflict environment, let alone one as dreadful as that ongoing in Syria. So I have the luxury of having all the questions. What are the tasks ahead? What are the prospects for success? What are the implications for Syria, for the region, for the broader international community of failure? For that matter, what are the implications of success? And so for the answers, look to our colleagues. First, Michael.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for coming tonight on such a lovely evening. I'm sure you were drawn elsewhere. Usually I have to begin with the standard disclaimers and so on. Tonight that's especially the case because with the government shutdown, I'm not supposed to be working. So I am not here for CRS. CRS is not even part of the picture tonight. I'm here as someone who has been a denizen of the CBW world for the last 25 years or so, including a participant in the negotiation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, especially the endgame in the senior Bush administration when the treaty actually was brought to a successful conclusion. So it's in that context, not the CRS context, that I hope you'll take my comments. In terms of trying to answer some of the questions that Susan posed, I'm going to focus on the weeds, and Joel's going to look at the bigger picture, the regional and political dynamics. I'm going to look at questions associated with the implementation of what has happened thus far. My starting point are the two decisions or documents that provide essentially the authorities under which this process has been initiated and will continue. The first of those was the decision by the Executive Council of the OPCW, which is its decision-making body. That decision was taken on the 27th of September, and it includes the requirement, some of the things that Susan's already mentioned, things like a declaration from Syria within a week regarding the composition and size of its stockpile, including its precursor chemicals, the types of munitions, submunitions, and devices for delivery, and the locations of the stocks themselves, as well as the locations of storage, production facilities, mixing and filling facilities, as well as CW-related research and development facilities. It also calls for destruction and production by the first of production and filling and mixing facilities by the 1st of November, the elimination of its capabilities by the end of the first half of 2014. It's important to note that in that decision, it's the Syrian government that is identified as responsible for the destruction under the supervision of the United Nations and the OPCW. It is not the OPCW experts or the UN themselves who are doing the destruction. They're ensuring that the Syrians are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And finally, the decision calls for Syria to cooperate fully with all aspects of the implementation of this decision, including by providing the OPCW personnel with the immediate and unfettered rights to inspect any and all sites in Syria. That's obviously a key provision. That was immediately followed by approval then of the resolution in the UN Security Council, which had the following key elements to it. One, it endorsed the OPCW decision and the overall framework that it established. It asked the Secretary General to submit a plan for its implementation. It reiterated the need for Syria to comply with all aspects of the decision, including the comments about unfettered access. It called on all member states to provide support, including personnel, technical assistance, information, equipment, and financial and other resources. And it decided that in the event of noncompliance, that the Security Council could impose measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which is the chapter that allows for the use of military force, although the resolution itself was silent on any specific responses that the Security Council may take in the event that noncompliance was established. And in and of itself, that is a potentially political issue. So what happened Immediately after that, Syria did provide, within the week that it called for, an initial declaration with respect to those elements that were identified in the OPCW plan and the resolution, and it was generally considered to be fairly good in terms of the overall reactions, both by the OPCW technical people as well as comments indicating that at first blush by U.S. policy officials, it was looking pretty good. The OPCW, however, did have some questions, and they asked for additional information and answers to questions they had with respect to the declarations. One of the outstanding uncertainties, for example, was the number of sites that were involved, given that Syria had dispersed its CW stocks from more central locations to a number of smaller additional sites. An additional document was then handed over by Syria on October 2nd, and while it was described as looking promising, again by the OPCW spokesperson, it also indicated that further analysis, especially of some of the technical issues and other information, would be necessary. Then on Monday, this last Monday, the UN Secretary General submitted his plan to the Security Council as was called for in the resolution. And this is important because this lays the groundwork for going forward. In that document, the Secretary General calls for a three-phase approach that will be implemented by a joint team of about 100 UN political and security personnel and OPCW technical experts under the supervision of a yet-to-be-named special coordinator. Phase one, which actually was already ongoing by the time he got his plan together and put it forward, was to establish the initial presence in Damascus, conduct initial verification activities, particularly through dialogue with Syrian representatives to clarify some of the issues in their declarations, and conduct planning for site visits and verification activities in future phases. So already at the time, as Susan mentioned, there was a joint UN OPCW team in Syria of about 35 members, 19 technical experts from the OPCW, the rest UN support people. According to the OPC, and they initiated those activities, including destruction activities at mixing and filling sites, as well as some production. And according to the OPCW reports, Syrian personnel were observed by their technical experts using cutting torches and angle grinders to destroy or disable a range of materials, including missile warheads, aerial bombs, and mixing and filling equipment. So in a sense, it got off to a good start. Phase two is that phase through November 1st, at which the initial inspections will be completed of all of Syria's facilities, including production and storage, and oversee destruction of all production and mixing and filling equipment. This phase also includes the creation of a staging and support base in Cyprus to ensure that the mission, the joint mission as it is called, maintains a light footprint in Syria. Quote, only deploying to Syria those personnel whose presence is necessary in the country to perform their tasks. Obviously, in all of the communications, formal and informal, people have been stressing that the highest priority is the safety and security of the UN and OPCW personnel. This is another reason for putting the support operations, essentially, and some of the training activities that might be necessary in Cyprus rather than trying to do it in country. Phase three, which is described by Secretary General Ban as the most difficult and challenging, is one which is defined as support, monitor, and verify destruction of a complex CW program involving multiple sites spread over a country engulfed in violent conflict, which includes approximately 1,000 metric tons of chemical weapons, agents, and precursors that are dangerous to handle, dangerous to transport, and dangerous to destroy. It's also interesting that in this plan, the Secretary General comments on what he thinks will be needed for success of this joint mission. and there are several elements. First and foremost, obviously, is the sustained commitment by the Syrian authorities to fulfilling their obligations. Secondly, is continued support of the UN and the OPCW and key stakeholders. And the role of member states is defined as critical in their provision of material, technical, and operational assistance. Third, he identifies close partnership between the UN and the OPCW, which is their first joint mission ever. And he also discusses as a key to success prevailing public perceptions in Syria. So in a way, you could agree with Secretary Kerry that things are off to a good start, but some serious challenges await. And let me run through them briefly, and we can come back in the Q&A. First, security challenges. As Susan said, this is the first time that anything like this has ever been undertaken in hostile conditions. The Secretary General describes it as an operation the likes of which have never been tried before. Clearly, the UN OPCW team must operate in an environment that is dangerous, volatile, especially in the urban areas, Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo, where much of the chemical work was done, and where there is continuing military operations and the exchange of rocket fire, heavy artillery in some cases, mortar barrages, mortar rounds, and car bombs have already exploded near the hotel where the UN OPCW team has established their preliminary headquarters. It also will require active movement by the team across active confrontation lines, and in some cases through territory controlled by armed groups that are potentially hostile to the objectives of the mission. And in his press conference, I think it was yesterday or the day before, Director General Uzumcu at the OPCW talked about, in some cases, potentially the need for limited ceasefires to enable the team to do the work that it's going to do, whether it's transiting particular territory or actually going to a site that is either in an area that's contested or that is actually in territory under control of the opposition. Second issue, technical ones. Resources. 100 people, not all of whom are technical experts. There have been experts cited in the press who said that this kind of operation could take up to 1,000 people. That's probably an exaggeration, as people speaking to the media often do. But there is a question about, is this going to be a team that's big enough at 100, given that it's split between the kinds of political, logistical support that the UN will provide and the kind of technical requirements that the OPCW has. One example is the operation of destruction equipment. How are they going to destroy what it is they have? There are two basic ways to do it. One is incineration, and one is through neutralization. There are a number of portable systems that are available to do those, but they have been described as having to be operated by skilled technicians, which I don't think people would generally classify the Syrians as falling into that category. So will, in fact, OPCW or other qualified foreign technicians have to begin to become engaged in the process. Inspection modalities, can they find it all? Syria may have operated in good faith in terms of its declaration, but everybody knows there are incomplete records, sloppy accounting and handling, loss or unreported use of things. There's a lot of reasons why the information may not be correct. Unfettered access to sites and people. That's going to be a tough one, assuming continued Syrian cooperation. Location. Are they going to destroy all of the CW in situ? Or are they going to try to move it within country to a more centralized destruction facility? Or, as some people have talked about, are they going to move it out of the country? The CWC does not provide for transfer the CWC in fact prohibits the transfer of chemical weapons to a state party to the treaty, although the UN Security Council resolution says, no, that's okay, you can do it in this case as long as it's consistent with the objectives of the CWC. I think there's going to be some international lawyers earning their pay on that issue. So there are a host of technical issues. And finally, just a couple of political ones, and this kind of will move into what Joel's going to talk about, Syrian cooperation. Will it continue? Syria will be, on October 14th, a full party to the CWC with all the rights and privileges attaining thereto. They can invoke some provisions of the CWC, potentially, that may cause delay or disruption. People will refer to the Security Council's resolution that says, no, you can't do that, but it could be a way to slow things down. International cooperation. I think here is something that nobody's talked about, which is, will the UN members answer the Secretary General's call for providing the kind of wide variety of support that he has identified? Some countries certainly will. Others, maybe not so much. A third political area will be Russian cooperation. With the exception of this agreement, Russians haven't exactly cooperated on the Syrian matters generally. They do have a lot at stake in making this agreement work. And so I think maybe at the moment, at least in the short term, we're likely to get it. But then the issue becomes, what if an enforcement issue arises in the face of alleged noncompliance? And then I think all bets are off, because there is no specified immediate response. All that it says is the issue goes back to the Security Council. The Russians have already said it will be for them to decide whether it's a violation, that the severity of the violation has to rise to a certain level to justify taking action under the Security Council resolution, and that there is no guarantee, no specified guarantee for the use of any kind of military option in response to that, all of which, in the Russian view, has to be decided by the Security Council. And guess who can say no to any proposal that comes through the Security Council if they so feel it? So, good start, long way to go.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, World Affairs Council. And it's an honor to be here. A pleasure to talk about a difficult issue. Michael really laid it out extensively, and thank you for that. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that got us to this point. And I as mentioned, I work at a foundation dedicated to preventing the spread of nuclear weapons. We focus on weapons of mass destruction, for lack of a better term. Chemical weapons fall within that bailiwick, clearly. We also believe that diplomacy is the way to resolve these issues, and finding ways to get the international community exercised enough to engage and resolve these concerns without getting us into military conflict. That's the real goal, and that's what we're focused on. Now, the context we talked about, which is that Syria right now is a civil war that is really destroying the heart of the Middle East. We're talking about 125,000 dead in 2.5 years. Those are the estimates. We're talking about 7 to 8 million displaced, a couple million internally, a couple million externally, the other 5 or 6 internally. That's about 30% of the population. If you can imagine what that means to that country, and then to the fissures that creates. It's a sectarian conflict in many respects, although it's grown into that. At first, we all probably remember a couple of years ago, the street protests that were largely peaceful for many months, that were inspired by the Arab Spring protest movement of 2011. Well, that's really changed quite a bit. And we now see a sectarianism and Shia-Sunni split within the country, and different extremist groups piling in and really tearing apart a country that is at the pinpoint of many different interests in the region. That's very troubling. Now, to say the least. Now, the U.S. has not wanted to get involved. As Michael pointed out, we really stayed out of this. The president a year ago talked about a red line on chemical weapons, and then it's now estimated a dozen times, maybe 10 times, chemical weapons have been used at a modest level before the horrific attack of August 21st, which in a sense galvanized the administration and public opinion and international concern in a way that clearly had not up to that point been seen. And so then the administration said, this is enough, we're going to get involved, but kept the objectives limited, did not want to take on the heavy burden of using the military to resolve the conflict, and still wanted to try the diplomatic route. So all of a sudden, all of these issues are coming together, and we saw something domestically, politically here that I don't think anyone anticipated, certainly not the White House, which is that there would be massive American domestic political opposition across party lines to any American military involvement in Syria. Members of Congress were getting emails 400 to 10 against any military involvement. Now, this is after the president had made essentially his decision to conduct military operations. But then he went to Congress, and that was a good move, and that was the kind of move we need, because we're still healing politically from the fallout of the Iraq War and the lack of trust and the concern about how military operations affect our interests and our objectives overseas. And if we recall, the British Parliament, too, had a debate, and they voted down military involvement by the UK, by the British government. So all of that backdrop coming in, the administration getting into a tighter box in terms of not being able to get the authorization, or appearing not to be able to, but certainly in the Senate getting some support, getting a bill through, but not even getting a bill in the House through committee. So that's all happening. The skepticism is large, and the president does lay out from his perspective what the real objective was. And this is really important, because the backdrop of the Syrian civil war and the crisis and the regional fallout was not part of that specific objective at that time. The goal was to deter Assad from ever using chemical weapons again, to prevent such a mass atrocity. Now, the president had decided that the only way to do that was to essentially conduct operations that would prevent such use, because there was no apparent diplomatic way out. Fortunately, we saw some movement in that direction, and it's already been highlighted here, and we all know the story well about Secretary Kerry at a press conference when asked about what would prevent an American strike, which was likely going to happen regardless of the congressional vote, in my view. Secretary Kerry said, well, if they get rid of their chemical weapons. And now, this isn't by accident. The administration was talking about this internally for a year, was speaking to the Russians about this. This was not a new idea. I don't know why it came out at that moment, but we all see the results, which is that it kicked into gear a diplomatic process that brought us to the point where we actually now have a chance not only to see the elimination of the chemical weapons that Syria possesses, but to kickstart the diplomacy towards resolving this Syrian conflict. And that's the key pivot point here, is how to leverage the chemical weapons issue through these diplomatic channels into a broader resolution and political process on the Syrian civil war, and to cap it where it is and roll it back. The other objectives beyond eliminating the chemical weapons, of course, are stopping the killing, and the key partner in this, it has been Russia. Now, Russia, as we all know, is the patron, one of the patrons of the Assad regime. Iran is another patron. They're loath to see Assad go, but even they are recognizing that there is a need to have Assad potentially transfer out. How to do that and in what way, that's unknown. But we're even hearing discussions about 2014. Perhaps he won't run for re-election again, and that will help facilitate the process. Now, all of that would have been on hold, if not going in the other direction, if there had been military strikes by the U.S. That broader context, it would have been very difficult to have foreseen or to have seen the ability of the international community to engage in a process that they're holding in Geneva that would actually move in this direction of trying to resolve the conflict. And that's the real big trick. Now, there's been a lot of blowback against the president on this, on his decision to not strike militarily. Many in the region have questioned the president's strength, his resolve. Many in the Gulf, Israel, polls come out about concern about the president's willingness to use force when necessary, to hold Assad to account, to make these hard decisions. Well, I actually would argue that it's a harder decision to threaten force and then pull back, but it actually shows that this president was smart enough to threaten force and smart enough to move away from it when he saw an opportunity to log an achievement. And the key thing here now is, what does one do with this diplomatic opening? And the administration clearly understands, and we've seen this since the Syria decision, that one doesn't do diplomacy with one's friends, one does it with their enemies and their adversaries. We're seeing this now on Iran. We have discussions next week in Geneva about Iran's nuclear program between the UN Security Council members plus Germany and Iran to try to figure out how to cap Iran's nuclear program and roll it back and prevent their acquisition of a nuclear weapon. That's the kind of initiative that couldn't take place if the U.S. were engaged in military conflict without international affirmation. And I think, to Michael's point, the fact that the UN Security Council has now given the chapeau for international efforts to eliminate these chemical weapons and created at least the chance for an enforcement mechanism that's legitimate, that gives space for potential military action down the road if Assad does engage in the tactics that many remember regimes like his have taken, be it Saddam Hussein or even Muammar Gaddafi in the past, to avoid detection of their arsenal. So now, with diplomacy heading forward, we're going to look at more regional dynamics coming into play. We actually saw just recently a concern by Erdogan of Turkey about the direction where the U.S. is heading. Turkey has been very much on point about the Syria fight for the last 2.5 years. Where does the U.S. go? How does it engage with Turkey? How does it stabilize Jordan? All of these issues are going to be at the forefront, and they're going to be surrounding this ongoing discussion about chemical weapons and their elimination. And with that, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll take the well-known prerogative and ask the first couple of questions. First, to Joel. Many observers have indicated that important elements of the Syrian opposition are very concerned at the current trend on cooperation on chemical destruction, fearing that the successful elimination of chemical weapons would end international concern about Assad remaining in power. You don't seem to share that concern, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
Nowhere in the resolution the UN does it say that Assad is indemnified and protected from being pushed out of power. And it's understandable why the Syrian opposition would be unhappy with the United States deciding to not attack and bomb Assad's infrastructure. That could have impacted their capacity to really inflict damage on the Assad regime. And that was part of the debate in the Senate. We saw Senator McCain insert language in the bill that passed the Senate that through committee called on Congress to assert that the goal is to change the dynamics on the battlefield. And that was where the strikes could have potentially played a role. But Assad is militarily capped right now in a certain way. He used those chemical weapons, at least according to assessments, for a military purpose. On August 21st, those chemical weapons were used to defeat his adversary in a neighborhood that he could not defeat through conventional military force. And by deterring his use now of chemical weapons, by having this process in place of dismantlement of the chemical weapons and the international pressure and the Russian pressure. This deterrence limits his military capacity, and certainly the day after the weapons are eliminated, the next steps are still open. But the opposition is fractured, and that is a big concern for the United States as well.
Thank you. And Michael, as you mentioned, the Secretary General letter to the Security Council of Monday stressed the importance of international cooperation with this effort, of member states contributing to it, but without, at least to my knowledge, a lot of detail on what that would mean. And also, the U.S.-Russian Framework Agreement stressed that, I think it said more or less that transfer was one of the most efficient ways to accelerate elimination of the Syrian chemical program. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what would be likely realistic involvement by the United States, allies, Russia, regional states, anyone you would care in the implementation of the UN resolution.
Well, with respect to the transfer issue, how are you? First of all, I already mentioned the international legal question, and I'm not an international lawyer. Maybe it's already established as to which takes precedence, a Security Council resolution or the obligations under a treaty, the prohibitions under the treaty. Maybe that's set, but that is there to be resolved. But then you've got a couple of practical questions with respect to transfer. First of all, what are you going to transfer, and how are you going to do it? Which means you've got to have very secure technical capabilities. Maybe they're talking about the bulk agent that is there, which may in some ways be easier to deal with, but it's in the middle of a war zone. So what kinds of security operations are you going to need to move it from wherever it is to where you want it to go, to transfer it outside Syrian borders? And then that's the third question. When I first heard the option of transferring it, whether or not the treaty allowed it, my question was, who's going to take it? You look at the regional countries. Turkey? I don't think so. Jordan? Some people have talked about Jordan. Jordan has no destruction capabilities, and by the way, they've got some problems of their own with respect to the Syrian conflict, not least of which are hundreds of thousands of refugees sitting in refugee camps. And there is some concern that Jordan may, underneath the surface, may not be quite as stable as everybody hopes that it will be. So is Jordan the candidate? I've seen a story that the Russians and Americans have approached the Norwegians as a site for destruction. Well, okay, then you're talking about seaborne transport through the Med up to Norway. What is Norway going to do with it? Freeze it? I don't know. So I think it may be an option, and at the end of the day, it may be decided that it is, given the options they have, the safest, most secure, cheapest way to do what it is they need to do. But I think it is not a straightforward, well, let's just load it up in a few semis and rumble it through across the border to wherever it is that it's going to go. I don't think there's more to it than that. I think about how the United States moved out its unitary weapons, chemical weapons out of Germany. I mean, the years of planning that took was incredible because of the safety and security. You don't want a leak. You don't want an accidental release wherever it is that it might happen. So I think there are a lot of challenges in that way. And if I could just add a quick thing to Joel's answer, I think the fact that there is this second track now with respect to the possibility of a Geneva conference, it's not about whether or not the U.S. is going to walk away from trying to get Assad out. I don't think that's the question. I think it's, do we have the leverage to get him out in the context where the Geneva option is still being pursued? Because he's already indicated that by and large he's ruled out most of the elements of the opposition, as he's not going to talk to them. And many of them don't want to talk to him in Geneva either. So how he play those negotiations while he's doing everything he can to be cooperative on the CW side, he's throwing up one roadblock after another and allowing, and this is something I think we cannot forget, in this conflict, even if the allegations about government use in those smaller incidents, you're looking at less probably than 3,000 people who have been chemical weapons fatalities. You're looking at a conflict that has had more than 100,000 fatalities. Guns and bombs and mortars and rockets and aircraft do quite well, thank you very much. And he's, at this point, got more of them than the opposition. So it's not a question of, yes, he was militarily operating on a tactical level using CW to clear the opposition there. But he can fight them to a standstill, at least at this point with what he's got, I would think. And as long as he's doing that, then he's probably likely to stay around.
Happy notes. Okay, we'll open it up to questions.
What do you think the repercussions of an American strike on Syria would have been from the international community?
The White House was already taking steps to try to mitigate international fallout after an attack. They were already publicly signaling and privately signaling to Iran, to others in the region, that this would be limited. And if you recall, it was limited, focused, targeted, really trying to channel that. That said, those strikes, without some level of UN affirmation, would have really damaged, at that stage, the potential for getting international support for anything further. It would have likely had a problematic impact on the U.S.'s ability to channel its activities towards a political solution on Syria. These things tend to spin in different directions. Now, I wasn't personally worried about American military involvement going down a slippery slope in the sense of more and more potential for boots on the ground. I didn't think that was possible. But that said, that doesn't mean that the international community would have accepted that action or that it would have achieved the desired result. But the pressure that was exerted on the international community and on Russia, certainly it impacted them, by that strong position, got us to a place where we want to be, which is international support for eliminating these weapons, which need to be eliminated, and to doing it in a manner that is as thorough as possible. A strike would have likely hampered that outcome.
What is the historical precedent for a disarmament of this level? Is there any real historical evidence to suggest whether or not this kind of effort will be successful?
I think it's unprecedented in a variety of ways. One, not chemical weapons destruction, because in terms of quantities, because the United States and Russia have destroyed tens of thousands of tons of their CW. They're not finished yet, but the Russians were believed to have and declared ultimately a stockpile of about 40,000 tons. The U.S. had about 30,000 tons, and we're both somewhere roughly between 70 and 80% done. So it's not unprecedented. 1,000 tons is not bad, but with those two exceptions, Syria could well have been at the time, today, or at even the beginning, the third largest chemical stockpile in the world. at 1,000 tons. We have destroyed some other countries' chemical weapons stockpiles. Libya's have been done. Albania, when it joined the CWC, declared a small stockpile, and there have been some others, but they have been relatively minor, not 1,000 tons. But the big thing is nothing like this has ever been done in a conflict environment of the kind that you are seeing there. All of those sorts of destruction activities were in benign cooperative environments, and this is not that. And so the questions about the security of the people who are involved and the security of the stocks themselves, and just the question of going into a site in a contested area, will they be able to maintain security long enough, even if it's a small amount of CW, depending on the technology that they choose, will they be able to maintain a stable security environment in that period long enough to accomplish the task? That may require, as the Secretary General has indicated, a limited ceasefire to allow that to happen. Well, it's not clear that all of the opposition forces generally agree with destruction, with the goal of the mission necessarily. So in that sense, I think that it is unprecedented, and I think that the Secretary General's comments that they are undertaking an operation the likes of which have never been tried before is apt. We could do it. We can do it technically. We know that. We've done a lot more than that. But we've built purpose-built facilities to take those large quantities.
Putting Assad's compliance aside with everything that's going on, the fact that he already agreed to try and get rid of these weapons, will there be any repercussions directly related to what the attack did? And if so, what will they be? I mean, any international, what do you think the international community will do?
That is a question that will be answered in time, and the answer will be shaped by the outcome of the conflict itself. If it is the case that Assad remains in power, then probably little, especially if the CW destruction process ultimately is successful. If it is some other outcome than that, I don't think that everyone has given up the option of ultimately holding him accountable, whether that's in the context of the International Criminal Court or some other body, some ad hoc tribunal that they could also create. I think that issue is yet to be determined, and it will be, in my view at least, largely shaped by what the outcome of the conflict is.
Yeah, we're in a really pragmatic space right now, which is go after the chemical weapons, get them, deter their use again. But punishing the perpetrators of the crime, which I think is where you're going, there may be opportunities, frankly, to use that as leverage to ensure that the information about the program is as clear as it needs to be. But that's certainly not something that policymakers are talking about at the front end right now, not publicly at least.
What would you anticipate the action to be, if any, should the inspectors and the destruction teams undergo attack?
I think they'd immediately suspend. They wouldn't stop. They'd suspend their operations, pull everybody back to Cyprus, and take another look at what it is that they need to ensure the successful and safe mission, a successful and safe mission going forward. I think that the international community, as represented in The Hague at the OPCW, will not want to tuck its tail between its legs and say this just isn't possible in the wake of a single incident or attack. but I think they would suspend operations and kind of take stock of what it more is that they need in order to accomplish what it is they need to accomplish with respect to security and their mode of operation and what they have done up to that point. And then having made those decisions, I think they'd probably go in for another try. Now, if it proved to be a sustained, if they proved to be sustained targets for variety of activities, then that may at some point raise the question about the ultimate ability to do the job. And you can't blame them for that, I don't think. But I don't think in the first instance that would be the reaction. I think they'd say, okay, what more do we need? What kinds of things, what kinds of other equipment do we need? Do we need what kinds of maybe security forces, maybe beyond what the Syrian government is providing for us? How are we going to conduct, determine where we go? I mean, it's been very interesting. They've been very careful to, in all of the press releases and other things, the pictures and all that has come out so far, it's always at an undisclosed location. So they are clearly trying to operate with some degree of operational security with respect to, and some of that they learned from UNSCOM, I think. But my guess would be that's what they'll do. I'm also interested to see who they will select as their special coordinator, because I think that is a potentially absolutely critical job. If you look back at the UNSCOM experience, having Rolf Akeas as the executive secretary for UNSCOM was absolutely critical for ensuring its success. I mean, he was a real hero in how he handled maybe he wasn't the best administrator in the world, but boy, did he handle some of the political and tough decision-making, dealing not only with the Iraqis, but with the UN was a real challenge. And Amy Smithson's book on the biological aspects of UNSCOM just, I think, really underlines what a critical role he played. And that is one of those instances where having the right person in the right place at the right time can make a huge difference. And if you get the wrong one in, that will make a difference also.
Susan, Joel, Michael, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. Please join me in giving them all a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.